All right, good to go. So like Dawn said, my talk today is going to be, it's called Garden Design Demystified. And I really just had the idea to do a talk on garden design. And as I started pulling it together, I thought, a lot of times we look for just quick tips of what to do in our yard, but I really wanted to pull this discussion a little bit further out, and we're going to be looking at some gardens here at BBG, looking at some gardens across the country and across the world that are well known. They are done by incredible garden designers, and we're going to, instead of going ahead and jumping to your yard, we're going to talk about what are some things that keep drawing us back for centuries to these gardens, and what makes them special, what is it that makes them incredible gardens, and then how can we apply that to our own gardens. Like Dawn said, I have a background both in horticulture and in landscape architecture, and my job here at the gardens really is allowing me to pull both of those passions together into one job. So I do everything from kind of larger scale design to even just like planting plans, but I just love gardens because for me, and I hope for you, gardens really are this incredible meeting of nature and humans. We're making our place for ourselves within the wilderness. And I think I've realized even just over these past few months and weeks, the world just seems kind of a hard place, that the garden really stands as this beacon of hope where we can, I've just loved this quote. I'll just go ahead and read this quote. It says, "The garden is the last remaining luxury of our time. It demands the rarest and most precious thing in our society, time, attention, and space. It is the representative of nature, where we again use mind, knowledge, and manual skills in a careful approach to the world and its microcosm, namely the garden." And I love this because it doesn't try and back down from what a garden is. It takes time, it takes maintenance, it takes attention, and it takes space in this world. But it's such a beautiful act, and it's an incredible way to approach the world. And I think in these last few months, we've realized just what a incredible connection that is. So I'm not really going to be talking about like 10 steps to like never do work in your garden again. I'm really going to be talking about here's things that we can do to create beautiful places. And it does take a little bit of work, but I hope that by the end of this, you see that the work is just the most beautiful part of the journey. So I also want to start with a question. So at your computer, I wish y'all were out in front of me and I could see you, but just close your eyes for a second and think about what your most powerful garden memory is. Maybe it's a place that you visited on vacation, maybe it's a friend's garden, maybe it was a parent or a grandparent's garden when you were growing up. But I'm going to venture to guess that many of you are not thinking about a single plant. You're probably not thinking about one moment in time. You're probably thinking about an experience that you have, a memory that you cultivated over time. So I want you to kind of grab a hold of that as I move through this and just remember right when I said that question, what's your most powerful garden memory, what came to mind really does speak to what makes gardens compelling experiences. So for me, the most powerful garden memory that I had was it was when I studied abroad. I was a baby horticulture student, and we went for a summer, about 6 weeks, to England, and we packed in so many courses, we hardly had time to actually enjoy being in England, but we would go on all these garden tours. And one of them, you know, you've heard of all the great ones like Kew and Blenheim and Sissinghurst, but we loaded into the van and headed to this garden that I'd never heard of before. It was called Rousham. It's in Oxfordshire, and it doesn't have a tea room, it doesn't have a gift shop. A lot of people haven't heard of it, but you just pull in, you pay £5 at this little machine. There's not even like a ticket booth, and then the garden's yours. And so I would just walk blissfully unaware into this garden, and it's this beautiful old stately Gothic home. And you round this corner, and there's just a simple sign that points you to the gardens. And then there's this huge lawn that points you out towards the countryside, and you can see this pretty pristine statue there at the end. But when you get to the statue, kind of where those people are walking, if you look to the left, right there, there was this little path like this. This was the path. And I didn't know at first if I was supposed to go down this. I didn't know if it was kind of like a maintenance path, but my friends and I kind of dipped down this path. And what happened next was kind of what propelled me to continue on into landscape architecture, because from this moment on, I felt like there was a rope attached to my chest and that I was being pulled down each one of these paths to discover what was on the next side. So you pop out from this path and you're at this beautiful architectural structure that looks out to the countryside. And I had no idea that at this moment, I was experiencing what I would later learn was kind of the pinnacle of the English landscape movement under William Kent. And then you're pushed back into another path and you go down this alley where there's light streaming in through different trees, and there's this succession of shadows and light streaming through, and then there's this bright statue there at the end that's being illuminated by the sun. And then you pop out and you're at this other pool. And so you've been compressed and pop out, compressed, pop out, and then you kind of just want to pause and sit here and take in this little moment. And then you can see this rill of water that's heading back behind me. And if you follow that down, there's just this little trickle of water, and you pop out to this other little pool where there's this little grotto that you can stand under and take in this scene. And every time that I've visited Rousham, it's begun to rain. So one of my favorite things to do is just stand here in this grotto and watch the water kind of trickle down through the trees. And when I was standing here, I was really reminded of, I think it was so powerful to me because it reminded me of my home landscape in Alabama. This is from Bankhead National Forest, kind of a little bit north of Coleman. And I'm standing under a waterfall. I followed a creek to this big open pool. And this moment felt a lot like that moment standing under the grotto. And I love this quote. It says, "It's the effects we first see when we are in nature's presence that impress us the most and dwell the longest in our minds." And so really as a garden designer, we're observing nature, we're seeing kind of what compels us, what draws us back to it. We're taking those effects and then we're kind of cooking them together in the garden into this beautiful masterpiece. So when I was standing under this waterfall in Bankhead National Forest, it really was reminiscent. It drew on my memory of that here when I was standing in England in a completely different continent, when I was standing in this grotto listening to it rain. So all of that to say, I often find that it's a lot easier to talk about garden design through the lens of something else, and we all eat food. So I thought cooking might be, it's one of the easiest explanations that I've come to find for garden design. And I love Samin. She has this incredible documentary on Netflix that everyone should stop what they're doing and go watch. We'll stop after this webinar. But it's called Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. She has a cookbook, and then she did this documentary series, and she really talks about how if you're trying to learn how to cook, you just need to learn to master these 4 things in your cooking, and anyone can cook anything great. And I loved that because she's kind of demystifying this thing that can kind of feel like, well, I'm not gifted in cooking. And it makes it tangible because you understand all the parts that are at work together. And if you think about it, we pluck things from nature in our cooking. We might love the taste of something from our garden and pull that in with an herb. And I don't know if anyone's ever watched the documentary series Chef's Table, but I love this because it takes these world-renowned chefs and each chef kind of walks through their philosophy behind what they're cooking. And a lot of times they're drawing inspiration from nature. And that's what we're doing in the garden, is where you don't walk into the woods and find a 3-course meal. But you can take parts of what you find out in the world and cook them together in your kitchen to create something that tastes incredible. But you have to understand those parts that are coming together. So in the garden, that's what we're doing. And garden design is a very personal endeavor. and there's things that transcend any designer that make them great, but the things that I have found, so I'm not saying this is the end all be all to garden design, but the things that I have found through my research and through school and just traveling is the things that draw me to really wonderful gardens are these three tensions. So I'm going to talk a lot about today about opposite things being in tension with each other, because at its core, a garden is a tension between man and nature. We're kind of carving a place for ourselves out of the wilderness. We're bringing order to what can often feel like chaos. And then the things within a garden that make it compelling is things that are at tension with each other, like movement, the way that you pass through and experience a garden, and those moments that you want to pause and just soak it in. Like I was just talking about Rauscham, there's ephemerality, things that are changing, like the rain when I was at Rauscham, that didn't last forever, but it was this beautiful moment that kind of just washed the garden in this beautiful sound and smell, and just watching it hit the water. But there's also fixed point. You need structure. You need something that's binding the whole thing together. And then there's also this element to gardens of light and shadow, that we can plant trees that cast shadows, that you can know the angle of the sun and how things will be backlit and how they'll look at different times during the day. These are all things that we can kind of temper with in our garden design. So I love this quote too. Actually, Tom Stuart Smith, who's a British garden designer, one of his talks one time, he quoted Schelling, and I just thought that this was brilliant. He said, "Contradiction is life's mainspring and core. If there were only unity and everything were at peace, then truly nothing would want to stir and everything would sink into listlessness." And I think oftentimes we're kind of tempted to kind of broad stroke everything with something that we're comfortable with, but a lot of times it's through those tensions that two things are offset from each other. You're able to appreciate both things more fully when they're contrasting against each other. So the moments of movement through a garden, you can appreciate those more when you pause and there's a scene that you want to take in. We're going to start there with movement and pause. And this is really about a choreography in a garden, if you have to boil this tension down to one thing. So just like this picture that I showed you all from Rauscham, I had followed this little rill, this trickle of water, and it emptied into this pool, so that it was drawing me through the garden. But then you come to this moment, and you just want to sit and soak it in. And it's those two things playing off each other that I think make a garden compelling. And here's another quote from Mariana Van, I can never say her last name, I think it's Rensselaer. We'll go with that. She says, "It is the effort to create organic beauty, to compose a beautiful whole with a number of related parts, which makes a man an artist. Neither the production of a merely useful organism nor of a single beautiful detail suffices." And this last sentence is incredible. "A clearly told story or a single beautiful word is not a work of art, only a story told in beautifully connected words." So that's our challenge in designing gardens, is that we don't want to just create one single beautiful picture. It's really not just about the cars that are driving by your house. It's a relationship, and it's how it's all choreographed and knitted together that makes it compelling. So the first example I'm going to talk through is actually one of our gardens here at BBG. So if any of you are local, as soon as our garden gates are back open, I absolutely love the Wildflower Garden. It's in the northern tip of the garden. This is a map that was done of the garden, I believe in the 80s, 70s or 80s. And I really want you to notice the paths. And so when you look at this, you might think, oh, that's a little random because it's divorced from its topography in this picture. But when you're out there, you can actually see, well, I also threw in a picture. This is what the Wildflower Garden was before the Wildflower Garden was put in the 70s. It was just spindly little pine trees, Japanese privet, honeysuckle. But this is it today. And so you can see its topography. It has these beautiful rock outcroppings. There's high points and low points. And so the path, the choreography moving through the garden was really what set this garden into motion. That was the foundation that was laid before anything else was done in there. And this garden is actually the mastermind behind it was a man named Zenon Schreiber that Bobby Call, who was a champion of this garden, she was just an incredible influence here at the garden. She had a passion for native plants, and she wanted a wildflower garden at the Birmingham Botanical Gardens that would celebrate just the vast diversity that we have in Alabama. So she kind of tapped Zenon Schreiber. He was a rock gardens designer. He had won so many New York Flower Show awards. He'd won tons of gold medals, and so she was like, we want the best. And so Zenon came down here, and you can see him in that second picture on the left in the middle. He's in a little black cap. He's down in there, and he was a master at creating rock walls, laying paths, and he would come for about 3 to 4 weeks at a time and then go back to New York. And when he was gone, the ladies that were helping build this garden would take Polaroid pictures of different parts that they were developing and send them to Zenon, and then he would make notes on the side of the Polaroid pictures and mail them back. And so it was kind of like a Polaroid vision of attachments to an email. Probably took a lot longer too. I found this quote. He was very active in the American Rock Garden Society, and someone did a whole article on his philosophy behind paths and steps. It says that he would point out the damage done to poorly designed gardens, steps, and paths. Often one hears comments that it's too expensive to repair proper foundations. True enough, but time is also valuable. By all means, let's concentrate our resources on our plants by preparing our garden constructions just once. So when you're setting out to create a garden, this is, I believe, just the most important place to start, is laying the path, creating that structure, knowing the choreography that you want surrounding your garden. So this was called, I believe this was probably taken back in the 70s, and this structure still holds true today, these paths. So he really met the land where it was at, and he would curve these paths up to a viewpoint. So you were drawn through the garden, but then you would pause at the top, like where this bench is, to take in a view. And this is the garden today. There's beautiful mountain laurel in bloom, but don't you just want to walk up those steps and see what's at the top? And oftentimes there's just a perfectly placed bench for you to stop and take in a scene. And so that really is what movement and pause is about. It says two things contrasting together, that you don't want to just pass through the garden, not soak it in, but you also don't want it to be stagnant and for there just be one spot that you sit and you aren't passing through and experiencing it from different angles. And so the next concept that we're going to talk about is ephemerality and fixity. Fixity is kind of a funny word, but really this just, it's really talking about structure, but then also having that layer of whimsy in the garden where there's things that are changing. And this comes on a number of scales. So going back to Call, this is Schreiber and probably Miss Call down in the creek bed, and they're figuring out the sides of the creek. He's laying rocks. He would leave pockets for them to plant plants in there. And Call just has this incredible juxtaposition between the harsh layer of rocks. Call was actually a quarry during the Great Depression. And a lot of the stone that was quarried out of Call was used at the zoo, like at the zookeeper's cottage and the fish hatchery and some of their picnic pavilions and things. It's beautiful stone, but when they created a garden here, they really wanted the harshness of this rock to contrast against the lushness of the green plantings. So you can see how all these little maidenhair ferns are seeded into the cracks of the wall, and there's these lush ferns that come out, and this beautiful native azalea that just, you can imagine if that was just green behind that native azalea, it would not pop nearly as much as it does against the harshness of that rock wall. So really those two things set each other off, where you can appreciate both more. And here's another picture of just those beautiful outcroppings contrasted against the lush plantings in Call. And then as you're drawn in, so this is kind of the big picture moment, but then as you're drawn in, you're able to see kind of these little flowers that maybe you wouldn't notice at first, but then you're able to be drawn in and appreciate the diversity of Call. It's our native wildflower, the oak leaf hydrangea. So we're going to jump the ocean for a second. We're going to head over to France. One of the best examples of this concept of ephemerality and fixity, I believe, is at Les Jardins Plume, which is in Normandy. It's right outside Rouen, near the coast of France along the Channel. And the owners of this garden, the whole concept of the garden centers around the idea of a feather. So they took the idea of a feather and then they've played it out through all these garden rooms. They created this, these hedges are reminiscent of a kind of Renaissance French parterre, but they kind of removed the middle part of the parterre and put in it just this beautiful collection of perennials. You can see here, this is really where you see the idea of the feather, that they have all these, they're obsessed with grasses and perennials, and then they actually carved the hedge into these beautiful wave forms, so there's movement. So movement doesn't just have to be your paths, it can be how your eye moves through something. And then those hedges perfectly offset the change in the grasses. So you can imagine if this was just those beds were just solid, full of grasses and perennials, it wouldn't quite have the same effect as it does when all of these grasses are playing off of them. So those hedges are fixed. And I once had someone tell me, if a plant doesn't bloom, it has no place in my garden, it does nothing for me. And I totally understood where he was coming from. But I would challenge you that there is a place for things that don't bloom in your garden because you need structure. And even in the winter, this would be a beautiful picture of those grasses are cut back and you just have that beautiful wave of the hedge behind it. So even if things that don't bloom are still of incredible value in your garden. And I just love how they contrast all the different perennials with the grasses in this picture. And then ephemerality, so fruit, I thought this was brilliant. They, the apples appear on the tree in the fall, and then they fall down, and they actually collect all the apples and put them in the little squares that are surrounding the tree. And that's a moment that only lasts in the fall, but it's really celebrating that moment of harvest with apples. Another incredible garden. We're going to stay across the Atlantic for a little bit. We're going to jump the channel. So this is Great Dixter, which is right outside of Rye, which is right outside of Hastings along the coast of England at the southern coast. And this is a garden that was really born during the arts and crafts movement. So you can see these bulging yew hedges. So Christopher Lloyd's kind of who brought this garden to fame, and his father was just obsessed with topiary. And this is the Peacock Garden that this picture in this magazine is taken from. And you can imagine if none of those hedges were there and it was just plain perennials, it would be a little overwhelming. So those kind of help anchor it down. And then even surrounding the garden, there's this incredible ancient meadow. So I actually had the opportunity to work at this garden for about 3.5 months. And I got to watch this meadow go from frosty, so my poor little Alabama bones were freezing. I would layer up every single morning, and I had to, trek back and forth across this meadow, but I got to watch as this meadow came to life. So the first sign of spring was the crocus popping through, and you can see some daffodils are beginning to bloom. But then after the crocus is the daffodil moment down this little wheelbarrow path. And then there's buttercups and wild orchids and fritillaria and daisies and all kinds of things that there's just this continual succession. So ephemerality can also be the layers of plantings that you have. Not every plant's going to last for 12 months or your year. But there's a beauty in knowing like, oh, it's the crocus moment. You just want to soak up the crocus moment. And then right after that, it's the daffodils that come. So you're soaking up the daffodil moment. And then the fritillaria, there's this one little area of the meadow that was a little bit damper and it was under this tree and it was just covered with fritillaria. But it was just in that one spot where it was damp enough for the fritillaria and you just want to soak it in. But that moment doesn't last forever. But I think it's beautiful to be able to anticipate something and soak it in while it's there, and then you get to anticipate it for the next year. So we need not be afraid if something doesn't have an incredibly long bloom time, that there's beauty in soaking it in. And then there's ephemerality in just your ideas, that can change from year to year. So this is the Great Dixter House. There's these incredible, I believe those are boxwoods flanking either side of the front porch. They do these massive pot displays. And this was when I came in September, but then this was in spring. This is a different room of the garden. But you can see how you can just as soon as the bulbs are done blooming, you can pick up the pot and move it and place something else. And I just love that fluidity, that things and ideas can change. And then these are really famous steps at the back of the Great Dixter. They were designed by Edward Lutyens, who was the architect for the house. So these are called the Lutyens steps. So they're very symmetrical, but there's these planting pockets on either side. And you can see here, there's dwarf conifers. Who would have thought to put those in there? But if you come back at another time, well, maybe it's a whole cactus and succulent collection. So there's just this, there's a way that you can play with ephemerality. You don't have to just depend on the bloom time. You can kind of change up your ideas, try something new. So this is an ephemeral moment that just happens. Us as designers, we have no control over fog. This was a garden I worked at in Delaware called Winter Tour, and it's a old DuPont estate, and there's a 60-acre woodland garden surrounded by 1,000-acre estates. There's this beautiful meadow and a little pond, and walking to work every day, a lot of times it would be foggy. And but you can imagine, we don't have control over this, but in the children's gardens at Winter Tour, it's supposed to be like a fairy world, and there's this little ring of mushrooms, and it says never enter, like a fairy ring or something like that. So when children read that, of course, what are they going to do? They're going to enter the fairy ring. And as soon as they enter, there's this mist that comes up from the middle of these mushrooms. And it's kind of reminiscent of that foggy moment that was ephemeral. And this fog here, it doesn't last for forever, but there's something magical to something kind of appearing and disappearing. And then there's also just these moments in a garden. So I had the opportunity to work at Chanticleer, which is right outside of Philadelphia in Wayne, Pennsylvania, and it really celebrates the art of gardening. And they have, this was the old arrival to the house where the carriages would pull around for guests to enter the house. And I think it's brilliant. They've filled it with gravel and they rake it in different designs. So when I was there in August, it looked like this. But in about March, it's surrounded by cherry trees, and there's this moment where the petals from the cherry tree fall into the grooves of the raked gravel. And I think there's something beautiful about that. Probably only lasts for a week. You know, cherry blossoms are so ephemeral, but what a moment that you can anticipate all year. When it happens, you just kind of want to sit on one of those benches and soak it in. And then also at Chanticleer, they have this beautiful, I guess this would be called like a stone arbor. It's kind of magical just sitting under there and at a hot summer's day looking out to the garden beyond. But I got to help prune this, and it takes a lot of work. They have to prune these, I think, about 3 times a year, maybe more. It was very detailed how you had to prune it, but you were pruning it in order for this moment to happen, where the white wisteria would just hang down and the sun would illuminate it from above. And that lasts for maybe a week or 2. So it's ephemeral. It doesn't last for forever. I stole this from the head gardener, Jeff Lynch's Instagram. But what a moment, you know. But that arbor is fixed, and then things can fluctuate against it. And then the last concept that I'll talk about today is light and shadow. And you might be thinking like, okay, I don't control the sun. But there are ways that you can observe and capitalize upon how light is working in your garden. So just like at Rousham, there's different trees. So some of these trees in this alley are deciduous and some are evergreen. So at different times of the year, the light will filter through this alley in different ways. But like where I'm standing, I'm in the shadow. And then where my friend Seth is up ahead, he's in the shadow. But between us, there's this light, and there's this, I don't know, this magical quality to the fact that it's not just all one condition. And even here at this pool, the light is filtering in different ways. This was at Great Dixter one morning. I was weeding in this area and I looked up and the sunbeam was hitting these snowdrops just at that perfect moment. So that was kind of serendipitous, but that's magical. So as a designer, you think, whoa, how can I capture that and plan for that in my designs? Here's in Cole Wildflower Garden, the light streaming through, lighting up these Adamasco lilies. And that really is the question that artists have been asking for centuries. This is the Monet painting, and I don't know if anyone has been to his garden in Giverny in France, but he is said that he would set up multiple canvases around his garden, and as the light was changing, he would run around painting on different canvases, trying to capture that quality of light in different places. This is the same shot that he painted over and over and over again. You can see how the quality of light changes it from season to season. And that's what photographers are going after, is capturing light. That's what architects are doing. Sculpture, you're thinking about how light and shadow play off each other. So us as garden designers, as artists, there really is, oh yes, Dawn would like me to remind y'all that you can ask questions on the Q&A. And then we will answer those at the end. But as garden designers, that's what we're trying to do as well, is we can't just leave that up to chance. There will be many chance moments where light creates an incredible moment, but how can we manipulate that? We're drawn to the sunrise, to the sunsets. I put this picture in because I think why I'm so drawn to light is I grew up playing in the woods as a kid, and I just remember how the light would filter through those pines and the hardwoods in different ways. And so when I'm standing at Sissinghurst, this is called their nuttery. So these, I believe they're witch hazels that they've coppiced, and then they create this incredible dome. And there's just this sparkling ground cover of all these spring ephemerals and ferns that pop up, but that light is streaming through in different ways. And then you can tell that statue is placed right where the light is allowed to come in through the witch hazels. And that's planned, that's designed. And this is at Mount Cuba, which is the native plant garden in Delaware. It's very close to Winterthur where I worked, but this, you can see they've kind of manipulated light to fall down the pond and reflect the trees around. This is Les Jardins Plume again. So light, again, is playing a huge role. I mean, I just want to go sit in that table and chairs that's there to the left and just soak in the sunrise under that tree. Here's light backlighting a lot of these grasses. This is also at Chanticleer. The 2 weeks that I worked there, I would walk this way to work every morning, and you can see the light streaming in. I believe that this is, actually I have no idea what kind of tree that is, but it's huge, and you're standing under the shadow of that tree looking out upon the sun that is just lighting up the morning dew in the cut flower garden. So you can imagine if that bench was just sitting out in the middle of a grassy area, it wouldn't be quite as inviting as it is when you're backed by the shade of that big, beautiful tree. This is the flowery meadow at Chanticleer. This was in July, August. So this is Monarda time, and there were monarch butterflies just floating all around the scene. But it's so enchanting the way that the light is coming through and hitting that meadow in the early morning. And the master of this was Beatrix Ferrand. This is at Dumbarton Oaks in DC. It's in Georgetown. And she actually created they're pleached hornbeams, I believe. And you can see the two ladies sitting to the left, and they're sitting in the shade, but they're looking out to this sunny, beautiful pool full of aquatic plants in that statuary. So that was planned to kind of feel like you're in the shade and looking out onto the light. As designers, we can manipulate those moments. So I know I've shown you a lot of gardens that are some of the best in the world, but I want to challenge you that I think a lot of times we look at pictures in a magazine and we often think like, well, I could never have that at my home because maybe it's in England, maybe it's in Australia. But I would challenge us to begin to look at pictures and start ask if it speaks to you. Ask why. What is it about this picture that is compelling to me? So I went down to our library and I took some pictures of just things in magazines that caught my eye. One of my favorites is Garden Design magazine, which is no longer in print. I believe that's what this one came out of. But why do I love this? Oh, I love how the path slices through that ground plane condition. I love how those look like beech hedges are creating a room. I love how the light is filtering in through, it looks like a cherry. It has all of those qualities that I just talked about. Why do I love this? Well, I love the color. I love the contrast between just that lushness with kind of that orderly line between this lushness and the turf. And I love how the different colors are playing off each other. I love the structure of the hedge that's behind it. This is from California, so I can't grow hardly any of these plants out in my garden. But why do I love this? Oh, I love the silvery foliage of that. It looks like some kind of agave or aloe. It just pops in the middle of that really feathery grass that's coming out from the side of it. So its textures are contrasting, and that evergreen that's behind it, that deep green contrasts the silver and the white of the other grasses. I love the limey green pop in front of it, and how the stairs just make you want to go to the top of them and take in the view, whatever it is at the top. This is Late Jardin Plume, which I've talked a lot about, but man, don't you just want to sit in that table and chairs right next to that pool of water, taking in just you can imagine the breeze blowing all of these grasses and perennials in the wind. This is from Pete Oldwolf's personal garden. He was the planting designer at the High Line, and I can imagine it would not be very pleasant on a hot summer day to sit on that bench in the heat of the day. But this time of day, it looks like the sun is setting and it's illuminating the back of those grasses. Like, wow, I want to be sitting on that bench. I love the repetition of the pink in this picture and just the contrast of textures. I love how the light is backlighting these seed heads. This is an autumn picture. I have no idea where it is. But the forms of those different textures contrast against each other and just pop. And so the same thing that draws me down this is at Hortulus, and it's also in Pennsylvania. So I think that everyone needs to go on a garden tour of Pennsylvania. They have incredible gardens up there. But these river birches with the ground cover of ferns, and it looks like some other plant there on the right. But I want to walk down that and see what's at the end. It draws me through. And it's doing the same thing here at Winter Tour. I want to walk down that path and see what's around that curve. It's doing the same thing here at Chanticleer. I want to follow that little stone path and see where it leads me on the other side. And all of those textures are contrasting with each other. So you're probably thinking, great, Molly. These are some wonderful examples, but they're nothing like my home garden. Which I live in an apartment, so I couldn't take my own home garden and do this exercise with. So I took my parents' house. And I thought, okay, maybe I'll just walk through how I would kind of start conceptualizing a design. And I know this house backward and forwards because I grew up there. These were the plants of my childhood. So if I was going to approach this and kind of conceptualize a design here, I would first want to know how it's used. I know that day to day, my parents pull in the driveway and normally come in the back door. There's a beautiful hackberry that arches over the driveway, and there's a beautiful holly on the corner of the house and a ginkgo right in the middle of the grass in the backyard. There's a huge magnolia on the southern end of the house, and there's just this kind of enchanting little woodlandy area behind it. And then my dad has come to love a lot of native plants and has this little native plant area on the southern end of the house. There's a little playhouse down back in the woods with another huge hackberry that kind of arches over and frames that house with some cherry trees sprinkled in the woodlands in the back. And my parents love having people over to the house. They love having places to entertain people. And most of my fondest memories in my house are on the back porch. So there's places where you just want to pause and take in the yard, take in people's company. But there's also some things that I know my parents would want. So I made some notes. So first of all, my parents have lovely boxwoods in front of their house, but we need some more blooms. So you can see right next to the walkway. I wish y'all could see my pointer, but I think they need a little perennial border. As you walk up to the door, that's where their guests would arrive. They would add this layer of ephemerality to it. You can see it out the dining room window. I also know that my mom loves peonies, and she loves her roses. So there's just kind of this like moment in May where everything that she loves comes into bloom. So I would love to find a spot where we could design the area for her peonies, and then that back and like really enchanting little woodland part behind the magnolia. I think there needs to be all these little woodland understory trees. Right now there's just some kind of larger canopy trees, but I think it would be just lovely to have maybe a path that you move through and can go behind the playhouse into the other woodlandy bits and get some movement into the garden instead of it just being taken in from the back porch. There's some areas of the yard where my dad struggles to keep it watered because there's bedrock just like 3 inches below the turf. And I think it would be beautiful to expose that rock to really celebrate this ridge, this rock ridge line that they live on. Um, so there's this layer of kind of knowing your needs in your own yard or your own garden, but then also pulling it back up and thinking, okay, how do I move? What's going to draw me down to different parts? What are some static areas of my garden? Where could I add in some more interest, more ephemerality? Where could I really celebrate the seasons? Maybe I have too much of a hodgepodge and I need some structure to kind of knit everything together. What is an area that you would love to sit, maybe under a tree? Maybe you need to plant a tree where you could sit in this lovely area in the shade and really take in peonies that are out in the sun. So you can kind of start from on the ground, knowing what your needs are, and then pull it back out and kind of make sure that you're choreographing it all together properly. And this is also how you approach planting design. So that was kind of like a bigger scale thought. But I just recently redesigned a perennial border here at the gardens, and I had to think about those same exact things. I had to have structure in the border, which I got through these repetitions of roof iris, and I have certain shrubs in strategic locations. I needed ephemerality, so I have pops of things that don't last very long, like a stilbea in bloom right now. They'll only last for a couple weeks and they'll be gone. But then I have coneflowers and rudbeckia that will provide interest through the entire summer. And then I have these little threads like daisies and columbine that knit through the whole thing, that provide that movement of the eye. Your eye kind of dances down the border from one to another. So these big thought ideas can apply also to just planting design. And here's a picture of the border. You can see the roof iris, they're kind of arching over the front, and the dianthus on either side. Those two things are contrasting with each other, but right behind them is an oak leaf hydrangea, so that'll be there when all the bulbs are in bloom in the spring. And then there's asters to the left of the oak leaf hydrangea. That will carry us all the way until frost. They'll begin blooming at the end of the summer. So there's just all these layers that you can think about, but the same principles apply. And there's one final contrast that I wanted to speak about, and I believe it's the most important. And in my thesis in grad school, well, in landscape architecture, we talk a lot about genus loci. I don't know if any of you have heard that term before, but it's basically just Latin for spirit of the place. So it's kind of the antithesis to just kind of going onto a site and mowing everything down and building whatever's in your head. It's really approaching a site and kind of drawing out of it what's innately there, but enhancing it, and it's being respectful of the spirit of a place. But when I was doing my thesis research, I realized like there's really this whole other aspect to gardens that also make them compelling, and that's the people behind them. And so I called that anima is Latin for soul, and so I coined the term genus animi, which means just like the spirit of the soul, the spirit of that person. So it's going to give you a couple of examples of how that can manifest in your garden, because one of the most important parts of your garden is you and what you like. But you have to have kind of a framework. You can't have the whole world in your garden. So like what matters to you, what story are you trying to tell, and how you distill that down into your garden. So one of our volunteers here, Gail, she invited me out to her garden, and she's passionate about native plants. So her whole garden is seen through the lens of native plants. So in this drive, most people would have just had turf in this roundabout driveway, but she has it filled with just the most incredible diversity of native plants. But she has structure in there. She has things that bloom and go away. She has that beautiful low stone rock wall. That's another structural anchor point. She has these beautiful paths and rock. So that rock gives fixity to the ephemerality of these perennials that'll come and go. throughout the season. She celebrates the spirit of the place, the water, celebrating Alabama's native aquatic flora. Movement, I loved this because your eye is just drawn down that little stone path in the edge of that bed. And just the contrast of the Monarda with the Spigelia. And the lushness of that fern against the rock. And you just want to you want to keep going down that path and see what's at the other end. I love this because there's movement. You want to go down that path, but then you can see those chairs at the end with the light coming through in different ways. Like, that's magical. This has movement. This has a place where you want to pause. It has light. It has shadow. There's ephemerality in those ferns. There's a fixity of the trunks of the trees. This has everything encapsulated in one, but it's through Gail's lens, which is native plants. This is Charlotte, who I met when I was in England. She lived down the road from Great Dixter and invited us to come see her garden, but she is obsessed with topiary. And she and her husband moved to this little garden right when they got married. It was just a field, and for wedding presents, they asked everyone to just give cuttings from their own garden so they could have a piece of all their friends in their garden. She created this beautiful garden. And it's quirky, but it's Charlotte. And it just spoke so much of her. And she would go around and tell you, she had one topiary this is her border collie Bill. So she had one topiary that was Bill, and another one that was one of her sheep, another one that was a teapot. So maybe you're not passionate about topiary, but what made this garden special is that it was just this outpouring of Charlotte's passion. This is Elizabeth Strangman, and her passion is hellebores. She is kind of the authority, one of the world authorities on hellebores, Lenten roses, and had traveled all over the world. Here, my friend to the left is holding a hellebore that she discovered, I believe, in the steppes of Turkey. It was the first hellebore that was a double flower that she helped introduce to the trade. So her garden is a celebration of hellebores, just one kind of plant, but it's Elizabeth. This is Rosemary Alexander's garden in, I believe, Sussex, and I got to go stay with her for one weekend, and I just got to take in this garden. Rosemary is the head of the English School for Garden Design, the English Gardening School. And so her garden really is about testing all these ideas. So she's testing all kinds of plants, she's testing out ideas. And my favorite was the weekend before, or the day before I showed up, she had gotten this idea in her head to have a fernery. She wanted her picture with me next to the fernery. She had gone into the woods and drug out all these stumps, and she wanted to create this fernery. And she had never had one before, and she wanted to see how it would work, because everyone was talking about, sorry, not a fernery, a stumpery. So I just thought that was so neat, because not everyone would want a stumpery, but Rosemary did. And this is a famous interior designer in Provence, and she really is minimalistic in her interior designs, and then her garden also reflected that these were indigenous shrubs and trees that were there, and she really just cut these paths into it, and it was really all about how light and shadow played off of these forms that she had just sculpted. And so it's very simple. It celebrated the rocks and the native grasses that would pop up, and then she just sculpted these shrubs into different shapes and forms. So that's about as minimalist as an approach as you could take. She also had nailed, this was a poem that she had written, and she nailed little pieces to a tree, so there was just this lightest touch, but to her, that's what she wanted her garden to be. But then you have Great Dixter, where they have 50 different kinds of dahlias that they're playing around with, and it's a plantsman's garden, and it's this whole song and dance within the boundaries of these different garden rooms. Like when I was there, we planted out this, I remember the head gardener saying, it's going to be an aster dream. And he really wanted to throw any kind of aster into this area. And this is what it looked like in probably August, September. It was an aster dream. Maybe you hate asters, and that's not what you want in your garden. So the most important part of a garden, I believe, is that personal touch. And Dixter's really about color, experimenting, it's excitement in gardening. And I'll end on this quote. This is one of my favorite garden designers. She's Southern, Elizabeth Florence. She said, "This is the gate of my garden. I invite you to enter. not just into my garden, but into the world of gardens. A world as old as the history of man, as new as the latest contribution of science, a world of mystery, adventure, and romance, a world of poetry and philosophy, a world of beauty, and a world of work. Any garden demands as much of its maker as he has to give, but I do not need to tell you that if you are a gardener, that no other undertaking will give as great a return for the amount of effort put into it. So I just wanted to end on that because gardening really isn't about as much the end product. It really is, it's a relationship between you and the place, and it's cultivated over time. And as much as you put into it, you'll get out of it. And I just love that kind of demystifies what we think of a garden as it being unattainable, because it really is. And the biggest part of it is you. This little collage I like to end on that's just showing like all these little moments that a garden really isn't wrapped up into just one moment. It's a bunch of little moments that add up over time to make it a really compelling place. And that's what we seek to do here at Birmingham Botanical Gardens. I work for the Friends of Birmingham Botanical Gardens, and our mission is to protect, nurture, and share the wonders of Birmingham Botanical Gardens. And we can't wait for our gates to open in the near future, hopefully, and to be able to invite you back in for just the mystery and the wonder that's held here. And that's what we do as the Friends. Is we are a nonprofit. We help support the work of the city of Birmingham here at the Gardens, and we are a membership-based organization. And especially in these times, as we haven't been able to have a lot of our fundraisers and different things, membership has become very important. So if you would like to support the Gardens and our educational efforts and to support the ongoing development of the Gardens, we would love to have you as a member of the Gardens. And you can go to bbg.org/membership to become a member. And that ends my portion. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Hey everyone, so we hope you really enjoyed Molly's talk, and right now we're going to answer some of the questions that y'all put in chat, and as well as the Q&A. So the first question I saw was in the chat, and someone wanted to know what was their first English garden that you mentioned in your presentation.
So that garden it's called Rousham, and it's in Oxfordshire, and it was designed, I think Charles Bridgman had been there before William Kent came on the scene, but you would need a car to get there. But if you ever are in England, there's so many incredible gardens right there in that area. It's right near the Cotswolds. It's right down the road from Blenheim Palace, but it really, any garden designer that I've really admired and then listened to some of their talks, they normally at some point bring up Rousham, because it's just this perfectly distilled and preserved example of just like the best of what makes garden design compelling. So if you're there, I highly recommend visiting.
Okay. What tips do you have to create movement and space in our garden for those of us with a smaller space to work with?
That's a great question, because I've been thinking about that a lot since I live in a apartment now. I think movement, I showed a lot of examples of paths, like moving down paths, but I think movement can also be with the eyes. So maybe your eyes are drawn through a space in different ways. That was a trick of the English landscape movements. They create follies on the hill beyond that would draw your eye through the countryside up, and it wouldn't actually be a real building. It would just be the facade of it. But I think in a small space, repetition is a way that you can create, what's the word I'm looking for? Depth to the garden. It also creates structure. And then pots are an incredible way to create, it was movement and
Movement in a space that's small.
okay. I really think that you can do a lot with pots that creates ephemerality. So you could kind of change them out as the seasons go. And then that is hard. Like I'm trying to think at my place how to create movement. I really think it's just creating pops that draw your eyes through. So it's by using repetition.
I'm coming back. I had to get hand sanitizer because I touched my nose, because that's one of the things that I keep forgetting not to do. Another question was, do you have any resources or tricks to share to help people predict light as the sun and angles move through the year?
Ooh, that's another great question. I would say for a home gardener, there probably are apps out there. Um, I I find it hard to rely on an outside source for studying light. I just use my eyes. So, like with the perennial border in the Southern Living Garden, for those of you who are members, I just wrote kind of a much more extensive article that'll be coming out in the summer Garden Dirt magazine, talking about the process of designing that. But I spent a lot of time observing it, and so never underestimate the power of observation, and take notes because you think that you'll remember and you don't. Um, I've just found that apps sometimes they might get you kind of close to what you need to know, but they aren't going to give you those nuances that really make a garden tick. And one of my favorite garden designers, he's also British, if you're seeing a theme, his name is Dan Pearson, and he and Tom Stewart Smith have won so many different Chelsea flower shows. But he and his partner moved to the countryside, and I think he spent maybe 3 years observing the land. I'm not saying that you need to wait 3 years. I'm just trying to speak to the power of observation. Um, just watching the land and trying to get to know it, watching what comes up. If you move to a new house, I know that your instinct is just like plant, 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 but I would take a year, maybe reorganize the inside, redecorate, and then just watch your yard and kind of figure out where those special spots are, watch what comes up, also get situated and see how you're going to use the space. And then you'll be ready to make decisions. But I think for observing light, um, sometimes it takes planting something and seeing if it works. There's two aspects to light, is that plants have certain light condition needs, and then it's also just that magical layer to a design. So a lot of times you might notice, like I've noticed here at the gardens, there's some spots that are just pretty harsh in the middle of the day. And so maybe you realize, oh, I need a tree to kind of sit under, and that would really change the whole aspect of this. Or you notice that I know at my parents' house, the sun comes up to the east in the front of the house and it sets in the west. So when I was thinking about that back woodland area, I was thinking, how beautiful would it be to have some spring flowering trees and the sun sets behind them and backlights it. But I only know that because I've spent countless hours on that back porch watching the sunset in that back corner. So all of that to say, I hope that's not a cop-out answer, but really the most powerful tool is just your eyes and making notes.
And I actually got the first question wrong. They wanted to know the spelling of the first English garden you toured. So there's a marker behind you if you want to write it on the board behind you for them to see.
Okay, it's Rousham House and Garden. Can y'all see that? Okay. Rousham. Oh, it's backwards. It's Rousham.
Yeah, I see it. I think it's backwards to you, but not to
Oh, it's
us.
backwards to me. Okay.
Yeah. We are recording this session, so the recording will be available, but a lot of people asked if you would be willing to share your slides, Molly, so I will let you
Yes.
decide that.
I would love to share my slides. And I might go in and label the name of some of the gardens that I was showing, because I know it's sometimes hard to catch, and then you're just looking at a picture and that doesn't do much good. So I'll go in and label some things that I really can get down just these like Instagram holes or like internet holes where you discover one garden like Les Jardins Plume and you start reading about Patrick and Sylvie. I think the last name's Quibble? I'm not sure. But you start reading about them and their grasses and then how they were inspired by this garden. And so I would really encourage you, if this is like piqued an interest in garden design, um, just start looking people up, see what their inspirations are. And there's so much available, so many resources on the internet. And there's another, one of my friends in England, she and Noel Kingsbury run this course that's in the UK. It's called Garden Masterclass. And all over the country, they hold these on-site workshops just by leading garden designers, garden photographers, plant breeders, all kinds of really interesting things. But during lockdown, they haven't been able to hold those, obviously. So they were doing these things called tea time chats every day at, I believe it was 11 o'clock our time, or maybe it was, yeah, it was 11 o'clock our time. And they recorded them all and put them on YouTube. And it was just the most incredible array of garden designers, just plants people from all over the world, really. So I'll also include a link to that, but it's called Garden Masterclass. If you go to their website, they have all this listed. But I love listening to those things because you'll hear people talk, and then they might talk about a place that you've never heard of, and you can look that up. And there's just a whole world out there that we are very blessed to be able to access through the internet.
Okay. There are a lot of thank yous for just being here today and sharing all that you shared. And a lot of people are looking forward to seeing us again, especially at the Call Wildflower Garden. And the
Yes.
recording will be sent in a follow-up email that we're going to be sending to you all. In that email, there's also going to be a survey. We would really love it if you all would answer that survey, because it actually asks you all about technical issues that you've had. Because we had a few technical issues with the last session, and we want to just continue to ask you and make it a better experience for everyone. So thank y'all for joining us. Thank you, Molly, for presenting today, and we will see you all again in 2 weeks. So have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.